Mohammed Shehada, proud to say a friend of the pod. Welcome back to Kalam Podcast. How are you?
Thanks so
Well,
much for having me. Good to be back, Edgar.
yeah, thanks again for coming on. Last night, Israel conducted what they themselves referred to as severe airstrikes on Gaza, killing upwards of almost 100 people, including many children. This is almost becoming a recurring theme in what's at least known as the ceasefire, what Trump calls the peace plan. Uh, what happened last night, and how can we see this in the context of a so-called ceasefire?
Hmm. Well, what happened last night for me is not even déjà vu. It's Groundhog Day at this stage. I've lived through three Israeli wars, 10 military operations, and two ground invasion. Each single one of them ended with a ceasefire agreement. And as soon as the ceasefire went into effect, Israel violated it over and over and over again. Until Hamas would respond one way or another, and then Israel would point a finger and say, "Look, Hamas broke the ceasefire agreement. We have to retaliate." And then you have another escalation or war. This time around, we see Hamas being more self-restrained than before because they're badly beaten, and they don't want to provoke or give a pretext to Israel to resume the genocide and then suffer the consequences with their own people, with the Palestinian public, with the Gazan street. So we see them more restrained and cautious. We have a similar precedent. Last time around, there was a ceasefire between January and March this year. Israel violated it 962 times. They killed about 155 Gazan civilians during the ceasefire. Hamas did not respond with a single bullet. This time around, there's another layer of complication, which is basically that Israel is controlling over 58% of Gaza, declared it, quote, an extermination zone, and they marked it with a yellow line that's deadlier than the Berlin Wall. And nobody is allowed to be there whatsoever except for the IDF and four criminal proxy gangs that Israel has been cultivating. But in those areas, there are still Hamas militants in tunnels that have no idea that a ceasefire has been signed and have no ability to connect to the leadership in the rest of Gaza or abroad. They're completely cut off from the world. So it's a repetition of scenarios, for example, like Japan or Vietnam, where you had soldiers that had no idea whatsoever that the war was over, and they continued to hide in the trenches for decades. With those Hamas militants that are disconnected, isolated, and trapped, Israel has not created any way for them to come out. Instead, the Israelis continue to render this area an annihilation zone, which means that, if, for example, if you have a Hamas cell hiding in a tunnel in Rafah and their food rations are about to completely go vanish 100% and they're about to starve to death, they have one of two options: either stay in the tunnel and die by starvation or go out and engage the Israeli troops and die in battle. It's also the other scenario when the Israelis themselves, in the 58% of Gaza that they are controlling, they are continuing non-stop demolition work. So friends and family that live in close proximity to the so-called yellow line, they report to me that there's non-stop noises of destruction, demolition from bulldozers, as well as bombing. The Israeli army is detonating buildings from the inside and then getting settler contractors, private contractors, to come and finish the demolition work. So if the Israeli troops come very close to a tunnel where those isolated, trapped Hamas militants might be, they might come out, engage with the soldiers in clashes and fire at them so that they would die in battle. And that is the scenario that we had yesterday that we did not have in the last ceasefire or in previous ceasefires, because in previous ones, Hamas managed to maintain a chain of command and control. And Israel knew from the very beginning that this is a disconnected, isolated Hamas cell. So it was not an attack that was approved, greenlit, or instructed by the superior, the top leadership of the group. In other words, Israel knew exactly that this was nothing to do with a ceasefire violation from the Palestinian side, but they capitalized on it immediately to resume the genocide and killed over 100 Gazans overnight, including 35 kids. What you see right now is basically Netanyahu has been put on an American dog leash by Trump since the Trump deal went into effect. Trump is very clear. He's been sending babysitters nonstop to Israel. He went himself, then sent J.D. Vance, the vice president, then the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Jared Kushner and Witkoff are almost stationed there permanently now to make sure that Netanyahu would not collapse the agreement because he doesn't trust him on that at all. But at the same time, Netanyahu, within that dog leash, has a certain room of maneuver to violate the ceasefire as much as he wants before the Americans pull the brakes. So you see him, for example, not opening the Rafah border crossing, not allowing any reconstruction in Gaza, not allowing any shelters, tents, caravans, prefabricated homes, containers into Gaza, although the overwhelming majority of the population are literally on the street with the winter approaching. And the last thing is Netanyahu allowing the IDF to keep killing every day a certain amount of Gazans that would be low intensity. It would be flushed under the radar, and Trump would not object to it. At the same time, Netanyahu has been simultaneously trying to pull Trump towards him so that the dog leash extends the room of maneuver. And we see Netanyahu trying to build up a case with the Trump administration that they need to go back and resume the genocide because under flimsy excuses. So one is Hamas is not returning all the bodies of hostages in Gaza. And during the ceasefire negotiations, Hamas made it abundantly clear that they have no ability to reach all the bodies of hostages because they are buried underneath 50 million tons of rubble. In many cases, Israel bombed the captors and the captives together. So the group that knows where those hostages, the dead bodies are, is dead. There's no way of reaching to the conclusion of the precise location of those buried bodies that are under piles and piles and piles of rubble. And there is no machinery that Israel is allowing into Gaza, bulldozers, excavators, etc., to find those bodies. And Israel is not allowing Turkish or Qatari troops into Gaza that offered to go in and assist on the finding missions of those bodies. But Netanyahu has been using this to claim that Hamas is violating the ceasefire agreement and trying to pull Trump towards him to get more room of maneuver in Gaza. And the last element is that Netanyahu has been chewing on the leash that Trump put on him to break loose with incidents like the one we see in Rafah. There was a similar incident a week ago where an Israeli vehicle drove over unexploded ordnance and two soldiers were killed. Israel immediately claimed that it was a Hamas attack and they tried to break loose and to go on a rampage in Gaza. They killed 43 people in one day and dropped 153 tons of bombs in that single day before Trump called it off. And that's the same thing that happened now. Trump put the brakes down again, and at 10 in the morning today, Israel was back to resuming the ceasefire.
So, Israel, just to summarize what you said, Israel is allegedly or responding to alleged violations of the ceasefire by Hamas, which they are claiming are that Hamas militants have attacked Israeli military personnel and that they're not returning the bodies of the hostages. And what you're saying is that there are like isolated Hamas cells that have no contact with the Hamas leadership. You made the comparison to Japan, which is a fascinating one. I mean, in that case, there were, people for 40 years hiding in the jungle, not realizing that the war is over. But so the Hamas militants are in essentially bunkers or tunnels. And how is it that they don't know that there's a ceasefire? Why don't they have contact with their command?
Well, number one, there's no electricity. Number two, it's because they keep hearing the explosion sounds in the 58% that Israel is controlling. So they assume the genocide is still continuing. Because if they hear some quiet, they would emerge out of the tunnels and try to surveil the area and see what exactly is happening, or try to return to the other side of Gaza. But as long as they keep hearing the non-stop Israeli demolition work, explosions, mines, bulldozers in those areas, they assume that the war is still going. And the last element is Israel has deliberately been bragging about destroying Hamas's commands of control, the chain of command and control in Hamas, assassinating the top leaders, the middle leaders, the junior leaders, the battalion leaders, etc. So it ended up with those individual members. So it's rank and file militants with RPGs or Kalashnikovs that are operating autonomously. So the way it ended up in the last few months before the ceasefire was in place is that Israel has been working nonstop to prevent Hamas from regrouping. So Hamas instead moved into guerrilla warfare style, where they gave their cells and troops on the ground, the militants, full autonomy. So each cell, let's say 4 members, 8 members, are hiding in a tunnel or in a destroyed building or some place here and there, and they have a certain amount of weapons and a certain amount of food, and that's it. And they operate independent from the cell next door or a few meters away. They might even not know about their existence. And this way of compartmentalization is the classic way of maintaining an insurgency without being heavily affected by a decapitation strategy. So, if Israel assassinates the entire top leadership of Hamas, the insurgency would continue. Or if Israel apprehends a few of those cells, let's say Israel apprehends 100 cells, 1,000 Hamas members, they would not have knowledge about the whereabouts of the other members that are hiding. So each cell is guaranteeing the survival of the other one, even if they get captured or killed. And that is the mode of operation. If, like in the previous ceasefire, Hamas insisted on Israel withdrawing to a buffer zone that was only about 900 meters inside Gaza, all around. So it swallowed about 16% of Gaza's area, which is a significant number, but not as much as 58% that Israel controls now. In the earlier Trump agreement, the Israeli army was supposed to withdraw to the previous buffer zone, the one from the last ceasefire, and it was referred to as the Witkoff map. Then Netanyahu met with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff for 6 hours and inserted a few loopholes in the agreement here and there, and one of them was to allow Israel to keep 58% of Gaza. And Israel knew very well that in those areas there are still stranded, isolated, trapped, disconnected Hamas militants. If they were concerned about any of these individual attacks, they would have created a way for Hamas to evacuate those militants out. Because right now, Israel created a mechanism by which they allow Hamas militants to go into that 58%, into the annihilation zone, the buffer zone, and look for the bodies of hostages, accompanied by the Red Cross. So it's very easy for them to have created a similar mechanism for Hamas to retrieve all of its stranded and isolated militants, but they didn't want to because Netanyahu wanted to insert as many loopholes as possible in the agreement to guarantee that he can resume the genocide whenever he wanted. Another loophole, for example, is the Israeli proxy gangs in Gaza. So Israel has been cultivating 4 criminal gangs. They grouped them artificially. They basically hunted down, located people in the same predicament as Netanyahu, criminals on the run from authority who are facing justice and scared of that prospect. So they had a vested interest like Netanyahu in maintaining the war because it allowed them survival. And the Israeli army and Shin Bet, the Israeli National Security Agency, they tracked down some of those individuals, which includes a drug lord, a drug trafficker, Yasser Abu Shabab, with connections to ISIS in Sinai, an actual ISIS commander from Sinai, a Gazan called Amsam Nabahin, in addition to others, murderers, rapists, looters, thieves, robbers, gang members, etc. And they grouped them into these 4 gangs. There's one in the very south in Rafah, one in the very north, and one in Khan Yunis, and one in eastern Gaza City itself. And those gangs are there to guarantee that Israel can continue the genocide under the radar, outsource the blame for attacks on the ground. So they would send them to do hit and run operations or to do surveillance, espionage, collect intelligence, assassinate people, kidnap people, etc. And then they would run back again to the buffer zone and hide there. So it's sort of a tactic to provoke Hamas into a mouse trap that here we have those 4 gangs, they're gonna keep coming and attacking you. And if you try to come and attack them, you will find them very well hidden behind the yellow line, surrounded by IDF troops from everywhere. And there are other loopholes in the agreement as well. Netanyahu was very meticulous about this.
So I want to get back to these Israel-backed gangs in Gaza and Hamas's response to them a little bit later. But first, can you just say something about how you mentioned the metaphor of the dog leash? How long is this leash? Like how far can Israel go without the US putting its foot down?
Mm,
I mean, how and when does this ceasefire? When does Israel stop talking about a ceasefire?
mm. Well, until now, we see the dog leash having the clear limit that Netanyahu is not allowed to send troops on the ground, that he's not allowed to increase the amount of space that the IDF is occupying, that he's not allowed to move the yellow line deeper inside Gaza, and that he's not allowed to explicitly collapse the agreement. Anything else goes. For example, Israel bombed 2 days ago a group of Palestinians in Nusrat, in the Nusrat refugee camp, and then claimed that those were Islamic Jihad operatives and that they were planning an attack on Israel. They presented no evidence whatsoever, zero, none. They didn't even present the names of the people that they claim to have been assassinating surgically. If you're trying to bomb a dangerous militant, you would know the name of that militant in the first place. They did not present even any names, and they got away with it. They've been bombing people daily. So the average is Israel has been killing about 7 to 8 civilians per day. And Israel would immediately claim that, okay, we killed them because they came very close to the yellow line. And the yellow line is actually invisible. There's no way of seeing it. Israel began demarcating it in some areas with concrete blocks that are very deep inside the 42% of Gaza that they're not supposed to operate in. But in other areas, there's no line at all. It's an invisible one, an imaginary. And as soon as people not only cross it, if they come close to it, they get killed, and Israel uses that as an excuse. And we see Israel reneging on, for example, opening Gaza's only gateway to the world, the Rafah border crossing, the only gateway for people's movement, for people to return to Gaza and people to leave. And in the Trump agreement, it stated very clearly that Israel was supposed to open that Rafah crossing immediately and allow over 150,000 Gazans that are stuck in Egypt to return to Gaza. So Israel did not open it at all, not even one day. Israel was supposed to also immediately allow the reconstruction of Gaza. That's what Trump said. We will rebuild Gaza immediately. They did not allow any reconstruction material whatsoever. None. So the dog leash is very loose, but it has the clear limit. Just don't collapse the ceasefire officially, or don't go too far that your actions surface on the radar and the media would use it to say Trump's deal was a failure, or Netanyahu is playing Trump for a sucker. What you see here, like the reason we got the Trump agreement in the first place, is because Trump wanted the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's not my assessment. It is the verbatim quote from Arab mediators, the leaders of the Arab countries that have been mediating the ceasefire. They said that Kushner and Witkoff have been panicking. They kept telling them, Friday is the deadline. We need the deal before Friday. Friday is the day when the Nobel Peace Prize is announced. But he didn't get it. But he got the second best thing after this, which is unanimous positive media coverage from the very left to the very right media outlets in the US. All have been hailing Trump's success in getting a ceasefire in Gaza. And he's loving this. That's his dream. So he doesn't want this to collapse and to get all of those media outlets that have been praising him to say Trump is a fool and Netanyahu is playing him for a sucker. So that's the only limit that is imposed.
So, the day after the ceasefire, it was reported that Hamas managed to deploy 7,000 troops to
Mhm.
retake control over Gaza, over the security situation in Gaza, because, as we've mentioned, armed and criminal gangs that are backed by Israel have been wreaking havoc on Gaza and kind of terrorizing the population in parts of Gaza. How is it that Hamas has 7,000 troops to deploy? And after, ostensibly Israel committing a Western-backed genocide to destroy Hamas, that was the stated goal. How is it that Hamas can deploy 7,000 troops the day after the ceasefire? And what has it been doing in terms of
Mhm.
going after these gangs, and how should it be characterized?
Well, for Hamas, the ability to maintain the amount of troops they have is not a very difficult thing, specifically because the genocide created the utmost incentive for people to join, to pick up guns when they see a war that is directed at their own survival. Like if Israel had gone into this war and said, this is only a war against Hamas, we care for the civilians in Gaza, we only want to get Hamas out, and then you get to live without a blockade, without an occupation, you're going to get a normal life, you would have seen people flipping against Hamas in significant numbers. But
Mm.
instead, what you had is Israel coming out publicly from day one and saying every single person in Gaza is guilty. There are no innocents in Gaza, no food, no water, no electricity. And Netanyahu describing Gaza as Amalek, which is a command to kill every man, woman, child, and evil, cattle, and trees. So the way that the Israelis did it with that very clear genocidal intent and conduct, they turned people towards Hamas's arms. It's created a rallying around the flag effect. So no matter how many Hamas militants Israel killed, if you take by Israel's own account, or Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State at the time, or any intelligence agency, they said that no matter how many people Israel killed, Hamas managed to recruit even more. They managed to recover. The numbers are in dispute of how many Hamas militants were killed. Israel's way of calculating is that they look at the number of casualties and they take every single male, every single man between the ages of 16 to the age of 100 and count them as Hamas militants. That's the Israeli statistic. That's how you got to the number of 25,000 Hamas militants killed. Whereas there was recently an article in 972, the Israeli newspaper, that said there's a detailed Israeli intelligence database that shows only about 7,000 Hamas militants were killed. And that database is not confirmed militancy status. It's Hamas membership status. And Hamas is a government, a political party, a military group or military faction, non-state armed actor. And also they run a number of civil society organizations. So that's the biggest estimate that we have from 972 is 7,000 members of Hamas. The other question is, how did Hamas manage to deploy 7,000 troops in Gaza immediately? That number is also contested. So it came out in the BBC and Hamas denied it immediately. I have friends and colleagues on the ground in Gaza that told me that Hamas's visibility on the ground, their presence on the ground, is not even a fraction of what they used to be before October 7th. It is very clear that they've been heavily beaten. At the same time, what you see is throughout 24 months of genocide, Israel has been doing two things simultaneously: destroying any government infrastructure or going after any government personnel. So they assassinated the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Police, the Prime Minister, the acting Prime Minister, and assassinated policemen, first responders, anyone that is there to maintain a rudimentary level of civic order in Gaza or law and order. So there was this clear Israeli process. They blew up courthouses, the parliament, police stations, prison facilities, the attorney general's office, etc. So there was this systematic effort to destroy any ability for Gazans to govern themselves, to create this huge vacuum where you don't have any authority in place to keep society in check. So to create the law of the jungle. And at the same time, Israel has been doing the other thing of cultivating those criminal assets and gangs and using them as proxies to create chaos inside Gaza. So about 90% of UN trucks were getting looted by those gangs. 90% getting intercepted and looted. And the Washington Post in November last year, they ran a report that uncovered a UN internal memo that says this gang, Abu Shabab, that is being funded, that is being armed, that is being grouped, sheltered by Israel, is the gang responsible for looting their aid. So Israel has been doing those two things, creating a vacuum, creating a law of the jungle, and at the same time unleashing the worst criminal elements possible to expedite the societal collapse in Gaza. So as soon as the ceasefire came in place, Hamas had two goals, the declared objectives of its security crackdown. Number one is to disarm clans, gangs, families that have been receiving weapons either passively or actively from Israel, or have been receiving weapons other ways, if they find weapons on the street, on dead bodies of Hamas militants, etc. And number two is to apprehend or kill, neutralize criminals, outlaws, gang members, etc., people responsible for murder or looting or theft or robbery throughout the genocide. The names are known. Gaza is a very small space. If somebody has killed a family member of another family, everyone in Gaza would know that is the murderer, and he's walking around freely. So as soon as there was a ceasefire, that campaign started immediately. Why did Hamas try that campaign? They tried it for a number of reasons. One is to assert their visibility on the map, because the working assumption in Europe, for example, is that Hamas has been defeated and they are about to vanish completely. They will get dismantled, and that they agreed to the Trump deal because they wanted to surrender. So Hamas is trying to send the opposite message to say, no, the compromises they offered on the table are not indicative of defeat or surrender. It's rather exploratory. It's like feelers, testing out, seeing would moderation lead to improvement on the ground? How would Europeans and Americans respond to this? If they respond positively, you would see pragmatists in Hamas prevailing and those moderations and compromises being sustained. If there's no response, if it's taken for granted, the hardliners will take over. And there was the second goal of this security crackdown is basically the very sort of um, political one for Hamas's own legacy and survival. They see a lot of resentment in Gaza for October 7th and for the destruction that it allowed Israel to unleash on Gaza, that Israel had used it as a pretext to unleash this genocide, and they resent Hamas for this. So Hamas is looking around and saying, okay, what kind of tangible achievement can we give to people in Gaza in order to restore some legitimacy or popularity? And in recent months, particularly since June this year, Hamas noticed that its popularity was recovering slowly but steadily after the emergence of those criminal gangs. When you have an option as an average Gazan between an ISIS member, drug lord, drug trafficker, murderer, a criminal that spent 8 years in prison, and virtually every single member of his gang is either a collaborator, a murderer, a drug trafficker, a rapist, a thief, etc., and the entire gang has been starving you for 2 years, and you have the option between being ruled by this gang or having what you can say the devil you know, having Hamas in place, an autocratic government, but not a government of drug traffickers, rapists, etc. So it creates a rallying around the flag effect. And Hamas thought that if they go after those gangs, criminals, outlaws, etc., that it would recover some of their legitimacy, that they would tell Gazans, look, we are restoring your public safety, or we are unleashing a campaign of revenge and retribution on those individuals that have been terrorizing you for 2 years. But in that campaign, a lot can happen. A lot of devils can exist between the lines. So there could be Hamas militants that would want to take revenge on opponents, or there could be Hamas militants that want to take revenge like intra-family feuds or societal strife, all different reasons. Someone that is upset with a neighbor, someone that is devastated by an outspoken opponent. A lot can happen under the guise of going after collaborators because there's this very thick smoke of genocide and its aftermath and the societal collapse that if you call someone a collaborator, there would be little investigation of what got you to that conclusion, which is why we saw people from Gaza and abroad immediately trying to call for an end to extrajudicial executions. Um, my understanding is that Egypt and Qatar, they conveyed that message to Hamas, and Hamas promised to stop any public executions. They executed 7 individuals in the street in public and called them collaborators. And they went after one large, heavily armed family, Clan Dormush, and killed 32 people, arrested about 60. 8 members of the Hamas security force were killed in the process. But what they did with those 2 incidents is that they deliberately wanted to be extra aggressive to compensate for the shortage in the manpower and in the capacity. They wanted to set an example, a cautionary tale that would frighten other clans, other families, other gangs, other militias to step back in line. And we saw it working immediately after with at least 3 major clans, Majayda, Abu Maghassib, and Tarabin, that agreed to hand over their weapons to Hamas. But extrajudicial executions in general, it's never a good strategy. And that has been made abundantly clear to Hamas leaders because there's no due process. You can call anyone a collaborator. What is the guarantee that the person executing an alleged collaborator is not a collaborator himself?
Yeah.
What is the guarantee that there's no vendetta involved in this? Previous Hamas leaders, including Hamas's own founder, Ahmed Yassin, he said once in a testimony on Al Jazeera that when Hamas was doing similar executions during the first Intifada, a lot of mistakes were happening. and innocent people were killed that were not collaborators, and that Hamas had to pay compensation to the families and make amends with them. So it's the same situation. And I think the answer out of this is not to do this blanket justification for Hamas out of fear that any criticism would be weaponized by Israel to resume the genocide. And it's not to over demonize and exaggerate the situation on the ground to give Israel the credence it needs to resume the genocide. We see the Israeli embassy in Washington suddenly developing some care for the Gazan civilian population and putting on video the footage of Hamas executing those 7 individuals and saying, look, Hamas is going after civilians in Gaza. Well, Israel killed 75,000. That's the most minimal estimate. 7 to 75,000 is not a basically like a comparable ratio in the first place. But I think the middle ground between the two is getting the internationally trained police force, the Palestinian Authority police force in Gaza as soon as possible. There's 5,500 police members that have been trained in Egypt and Jordan exactly on riot control, on dismantling gangs, on maintaining security, rudimentary levels of civic order, law and order, etc. Netanyahu refused to let a single one of them into Gaza. Not one. The Egyptian chief of the intelligence went to Netanyahu and said, you should allow those people in. We vetted them, we cleared them, we trained them, Egypt and Jordan, the two countries with the most solid peace agreements with Israel. And Netanyahu refused. The other alternative is to allow an international stabilization mission into Gaza or a protection force that would defend or protect Gazans from Israel violating the ceasefire and would protect Gazans from Hamas's crackdown. Netanyahu has been refusing to allow them in as well. So you have a situation where Netanyahu is creating all kinds of obstacles in place to keep Hamas in power, to then cry wolf and use Hamas as a scarecrow to justify bombing Gaza and starving it until this moment.
Yeah, it's clear that is the strategy. It would be very difficult to describe it as anything else. Mohammed Shehada, I've taken up far too much of your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Kalam podcast, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity or a reason to speak in the future as well.
Thank you so much, Edgar, for having me. Always love our discussions.